Amen. It's good to see you all this morning. It is even better to be able to worship with each of you this morning, and I pray that that is what you've been doing thus far in the service. There are times in our lives where we realize we need help. We need assistance from another source outside of ourselves, and that concept isn't necessarily always a popular concept because if we're honest, we love the idea of being self-sufficient, independent, powerful creatures. But the reality is there are moments in our lives where we realize, like, as much as I can try, as much as I can do, I need the assistance of something outside of myself. I was reminded of that just a couple weeks ago when I was here at the church and there was a large piece of furniture that needed to be moved. And I looked around to see if there was anybody to give assistance, and I didn't see anybody, and I thought, I don't feel like trying to go to find somebody to help me. And it was in here, and my wife looked at me, and she could tell what I was getting ready to do, and she said, "John, don't you do it. Don't try to move that on your own." I said, "Sweetie, I think I can get this. I don't think I need anybody's help." And so I did. I started to try to move this large piece of furniture. I just put my shoulder into it and just tried to push. And I would love to tell you that what comes out of this story is that I realize how powerful of a creature I am and how strong and manly that I am. But that is not what I figured out that day. I actually figured out that if I continued to push that piece of furniture, I was going to have a hernia. And I am not nearly as strong as I thought. So what did I have to do? I had to ask for help. It was a humbling experience. It was one of those times where somebody came in and I was like, "Hey, you, I'm weak and I need your help to show me that I am weak in this moment." There are times in life where we need the help of other people, other things in our lives, and it's not easy to admit when we are weak. And certainly that applies to physical aspects of our lives, but all the more it applies to our spiritual lives. See, one of the things we say around here is your relationship with God is personal, but it wasn't meant to be done alone. And what we mean by that is we need help. We need encouragement. We need other sources outside of ourselves as we go through these spiritual journeys throughout life. See, a couple weeks ago, we started this series called Established. Established. We're looking at, okay, where are you and what are you supposed to do where you're at in your life right now in this moment? And a big danger that we can run into as we start to talk about what does it mean for me to be established in my life and what I'm supposed to do is we can start thinking it purely from the perspective of me. What do I need to do from myself, from my own power, even when it is we think, okay, well, I'm going to try to honor God, but I'm going to do it from my own source of strength. And what we run into when we try to do things in our own strength is we find out that we simply can't. It doesn't work. Because to be alive in Christ and our relationship with Christ is to realize the necessity that we cannot be alone. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a story of the Bible from Acts chapter 9, and this is a popular story. It's about a guy named Saul. And this is often referred to as the conversion of Saul. And that's going to be the big thing that happens. If you're familiar with this part of the Bible, here's what's going to happen. There's a guy named Saul who is against God, and now he's going to turn to Jesus. He's going to be saved. He's going to become a great missionary. He's going to impact the kingdom. He's going to write half of the New Testament. And when we look at this story, when we examine what's happening in his life, our temptation with the story of Saul is that we can make it simply about his conversion. Rather than seeing beyond the miracle of his salvation, when he goes from death to life, what happens in his life to lead him on that journey and to continue him on that journey. See, when we look at the story of Saul, here's what we're going to find. We're going to find a guy who is trying to be self-sufficient, empowered in himself. And he comes to a point in his life where he realizes, I can't do this alone. And I need something outside of me. See, if you have a Bible, I'm going to invite you open. We're going to just read this story together, and we're going to kind of dive into it together. We're going to be in Acts chapter 9, starting in verse 1. If you don't have a Bible, you're more than welcome to follow along with me on the screens here as we start in the first verse of Acts chapter 9. Here's what it says. Now Saul was breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. He went to the high priest and requested letters from him to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any men or women belonging to the way, that's Christianity, he might bring them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he traveled and was nearing Damascus, a light from heaven suddenly flashed around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who are you, Lord? Saul said. I am Jesus, the one who you are persecuting, he replied. But get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the sound but seeing no one. So Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could not see anything. So they took him by the hand and led him into Damascus. He was unable to see for 3 days and did not eat or drink. In our spiritual journey, what do we need that we cannot provide for ourselves? What do we need in our spiritual journey that we can't provide for ourselves? See, when we look at the character of Paul, he's an interesting character because from the perspective of Christianity, we hear that name Saul, if you're familiar with his story, and we immediately think he is a bad guy, right? And why is he a bad guy? Well, it says he was breathing out murderous threats against Christians. So as Christians, we take a little bit of offense to that. We think, okay, there's Saul, and he's contrary to where we stand. But what do we actually know about Saul? See, certainly Saul is not good, but why is he persecuting Christians? See, other than this, Saul wasn't a generally immoral person. He was actually a very religious person. He was an elite religious person. He followed the rules. He followed the laws in detail. He was respected in the community. He was somebody who had studied scriptures, knew the way things worked, tried to follow along, had appreciation for all of the history. He was someone who had learned under great teachers. And so when Saul encountered this Jesus movement, this new movement, he wasn't simply seeking to destroy it out of anger, but out of what he perceived as an obligation to God. What a great irony. Saul, who is described as an enemy of God, was doing what he did because he believed he was serving God by destroying the way, Christianity. See, in his own mind, Saul was a hero. And he was traveling to Damascus as a hero, obtaining letters to arrest Christians, and that's when something crazy happens to him. In his own journey, in his own understanding, in his own knowledge of God, here is where he is at in his life. And he's walking down the road, thinking that he is serving God, thinking that he is doing everything right, thinking that he doesn't need help from any other source, that he has got it all figured out, and that's where this big light shows up. I can only imagine what it must have been like to be here. I want you to imagine you're walking down the road with Saul, and all of a sudden, this big light, it is a blinding light. It overwhelms the road. It is bright enough that Saul immediately drops to the ground. And Saul begins to hear this voice. Everybody else just hears a noise, but for Saul, he can understand what the voice is saying. And it says this, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul's response is fascinating. He simply responds, who are you? Like, here is a guy who has dedicated his life to pursuing the things of God, yet when God speaks directly into his life, his response is, who are you? I don't recognize your voice. Jesus responds, it's Jesus. The one that you've been persecuting, the one you're trying to wipe out the movement, the one you're trying to stop what God is actually doing in the world around you. That's who it is. And so I'm going to send you into a city, and you're just going to wait for me because, Saul, for so long you've been trying to figure out what you should do for me rather than listening to what I'm telling you to do. Saul, you think you have it all figured out. You know so much about God, but you fail to have the relationship with God, so you're missing out on where you should be established in your life, and you're actually causing problems for what God is actually doing in the world. See, when we look at this story of Saul, we look at somebody who is not simply a bad person. We see a story of a man who was smart and studied and confessed God, and he was zealous for the traditions associated with God. He simply lacked one thing. He was so focused on his own understanding that he was completely blind to the very presence of God. So he simply said, Saul was trying to do this relationship with God without God. So we try to figure out what do we need? What do we need is we want to be established, and we're trying to figure out what do we do with our own lives and where should we be in our own lives. Here's where we start in our story. We need God. We need God. And we need Him to reveal what we cannot see because we are blind. There are things in our life that we are incapable of seeing about ourselves, so we need God to intervene in our lives, and we need to recognize that we need Him to intervene in our lives. See, when Jesus showed up in Saul's life, what did He reveal? He just revealed that Saul was blind in the first place. See, as you pursue God, the goal cannot be to figure out God. That only leads to a self-sufficient idolatry of knowledge and religion. But rather, our focus must be on desiring to be with God and to hear the very voice of God. To depend on Him to reveal what we cannot see on our own. I remember when I was in high school, one of my friends, he was on the wrestling team with me. He was physically blind. It was interesting wrestling against him because the way you wrestle with somebody who's blind, you have to maintain constant contact with him at all times. And so, but we also built a friendship, and I was interested to see what his life was like as somebody who was unable to see. And if you've ever known somebody who's blind, there's certain things that will fascinate you. One, you'll be fascinated about how much they are able to do, especially in an area in which, like with a walking cane or something like that, in a familiar area, how much they can get around easily. And it's almost as though they could see, because they can memorize and use sounds to figure out where objects are. So I was always fascinated about how much he could do as a blind person. But equally, there were times that I was reminded that he yet was still blind. See, when we would go to a new school for a wrestling tournament, what he would do is he would find one of us and he would hold on to our arm and we would walk around and we would make sure that he wasn't going to go into an area or walk into an area that would cause him harm. Now, what could he have done in that moment? He could have said, "No, I got it. I'll figure it out myself. I'll figure it out, and I don't need anybody's help, and I don't want anybody's help." And he could have just pretended, I'm not really blind. He could have said, "I don't want anybody's help in this." But I was always impressed with his humility with which he said, "Look, I know this is just part of who I am. And so when there is someone here to help me in a new and unfamiliar circumstance where I'm not sure where I'm supposed to go, I'm going to hold on to the arm of somebody who's going to get me safely where I need to be." Friends, we are spiritually blind. And I want you to understand, there are times in lives where we can kind of memorize where things are set. And we can walk through our spiritual lives and impress everybody else, not using what God is telling us, but using simply things that we have memorized about the things of God and depending on ourselves for walking through life. And we can impress everybody around us, but I want you to understand, it doesn't change the fact that we are spiritually blind, and we need God to guide us through every step of our journey. Trying to prove to God how self-sufficient we are, how we can figure out the answers without coming to Him, is not showing Him how great we have become. It is showing Him that we fail to remember that we are indeed blind. Saul was spiritually blind, and Jesus made him physically blind so he would understand what was happening. And that was in order to get his attention, to begin this relationship with God. Now, you in your life, you might not need that same level of intervention, but make no mistake, we all need God to disrupt our lives a little bit so that we pay attention to what it is that He is saying. Because if we don't, our default nature is to try to figure out lives for ourselves. To place our strength and our wisdom and our knowledge, even when we're trying to do things for God. Proverbs 3, 5 through 6. I think we have this on the screen for you. It says this, one of my favorite verses. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and what? Do not lean on your own, do not rely on your own understanding. In all your ways, what? Know Him, and He will make your path straight. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. And what should we do with our own understanding, our own knowledge, our own wisdom? We realize that it is insufficient. Jesus says, my grace is sufficient for you. He doesn't say your knowledge is sufficient for you. He doesn't say your power is sufficient for you. He says, my grace is sufficient for you. He says, lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. Friends, we must realize that we are blind, even as believers. If you're in this room, you say, John, I'm a Christian. I've been a Christian for 10 years or 20 years or 80 years, whatever that might be. That doesn't change that we're blind. It's a constant reminder that we need more of Jesus every single day. Oh, that I would stop trying to impress my God with how much I could do without Him and start depending more on Him. See, often we like to figure out what is best for our lives and then simply ask God to bless it. Hey, God, here's what I'd like to do. Would you bless it? Often we like to tell God what He needs to do in our lives rather than seek God's will of what He is willing to do in our lives. Often we get far too comfortable with the concept of a God that is going to follow us rather than being a people who will follow Him. I just got to ask you, Are you looking for God to follow you, or are you looking for you to follow God? Oh, we are blind. And we need God to intervene to reveal what we cannot see, so that we can simply more deeply depend on Him. Let's keep reading this passage and pick up in verse 10. There was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. And the Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias. Here I am, Lord, he replied. Get up and go to the street called Straight, the Lord said to him, to the house of Judas, and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, since he is praying there. In a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias coming to him and placing his hands on him so that he may regain his sight. Lord, Ananias answered, I have heard from many people about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem, and he has the authority from the chief priests to arrest all who call on your name. But the Lord said to him, Go. For this man is my chosen instrument to take my name to the Gentiles, kings, and Israelites. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. Get this. And Ananias went and entered the house, and he placed his hands on him and said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road you were traveling, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And at once something like scales fell from his eyes, and he regained his sight. Then he got up and he was baptized. And after taking some food, he regained his strength. Yes, Saul was part of the religious elite, but we should not take away from the danger that he posed to the Christians in that community. In his extremely misguided attempt to defend God, Saul became a very scary person, and he could arrest and potentially have killed the Christians in that community. And so you can only imagine Ananias' shock when he hears this vision from God. Ananias. Yes, God? I want you to go, and there's a street. It's called Straight. That's the name of the street. Once you go there, and there's a house. This guy named Judas answers the house. By the way, if you're really confused, like Saul, and there's another Saul in the Bible, and there's Judas here, and there's another Judas in the Bible, Ananias, and there was another Ananias. Look, they're just names like John. Super confusing. These are all new people now. I want you to go here. You're going to meet this guy. He's going to be in the house, and he's going to be waiting on you. And I want you to pray over him, and he's going to regain his sight. By the way, his name's Saul of Tarsus. What's Ananias' response? So, God, I'm not trying to question you, but I just want to make sure I heard everything, right? Saul of Tarsus, I don't know if you've heard, God, Saul of Tarsus has been going around trying to kill Christians, and I'm kind of one of those. And if I go and I pray to him in the name of Jesus, I'm probably going to get arrested and die. Are you sure that's what you want me to do, God? What's God say? He says, Ananias, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. He says, Ananias, I have a plan for this. I'm actually going to use Saul. Saul is my chosen instrument. He is going to go out, and he is going to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles and to the Israelites and to kings. I'm going to show him how much he will suffer for my name. And so Ananias, while it seems logical that he is apprehensive about going, he goes. He goes and he prays over Saul, and scales fall from his eyes, not just physically. Yes, Saul is able to see physically again, but it says that he places his faith in Jesus, and he is baptized, and he realizes that this Jesus that he had been persecuting all along was the one he had been seeking. And if we aren't careful, we will see this, and all of our attention becomes just on Saul. We see the miracle that is done in his life, and we could say, look at Saul, and look at all that Saul is going to do, and look at how much he's going to later go by the name Paul. Look how much he is going to do for the kingdom. And I want us to understand, if we make the mistake of turning this into a story about Saul rather than a story about the grace of God, then we are making the same mistake that he had in the first place. This is a story about what God has provided in his life that he didn't have on his own. And yes, Saul was used by God, but it was only after God had also used Ananias and many others to pour into the life of Saul, to share the wisdom that they had already learned, to share the faithfulness that God had already revealed to them, to help him develop as a brand new believer. What do we need in our spiritual journeys? Yes, we need the very presence of God to reveal where we are spiritually blind. Here's the second thing we need. We need spiritually mature believers to pour into the lives of others. We need people like Ananias, who are listening to the voice of God and saying, okay, I'm going to use the things that God has taught me, and I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to have it all figured out. I just simply have to be obedient. That I'm aware of that God has developed in my heart something that wasn't there before, and so I'm going to use that to speak into the lives of other people. You want to know one of the great benefits of the church? You want to know that one of the great things that I love about this church in particular? There's so many random people with so many different life experiences. And here's what has often happened in the American church. People just kind of come in and they attend the service and they remove themselves and they don't build these bonds of relationships with one another. And I want you to understand that as you look around this room and you see people with dark hair and people with gray hair, people who are young and people who are old, people who come from all different backgrounds, the benefit of the community of believers is that we get to share the wisdom of what God has already revealed in our lives with one another. Friends, if you're a younger believer in here, I want to encourage you. Find some of these saints who have been believers for a long time and hear their stories of what God has done in their lives and how He has revealed truth to them, because there is this wisdom that comes along with many years of following Jesus. Take full use of those things. And if you're in here and you've been following Jesus for a long time, don't keep it to yourself. Find those people who are brand new at this. Stop expecting them to have it figured out like you have, because you've just been doing it longer. Pour into their lives. That's the beauty of the community of believers. That's what happens in the life of Saul, a guy who was going to change the world. But it started here with Ananias being willing to get involved in his life. Friends, there are times in your life that you just have the opportunity to learn from the wisdom of others. Many of you might know that I'm part Japanese. I'm 1/4 Japanese. If you're new here, you're probably like trying to figure out, like, what are you? I get that a lot. What are you? I'm a human being. But if you'd like to know my ethnic background, I'm part Japanese. That's my mom's mom was from Japan, and my mama passed away a few years ago. But I remember when she was still living, one of the things I used to love to do is just ask her about that background. It's just something I didn't know much about. And so I'd ask her about, Mama, what was life like in Japan? And I'd like to sit around her when she was cooking and say, okay, Mama, show me how I can learn from what you have learned, and I want to hold on to this part of my history. And I can tell you the one regret that I have now that my mama is not here, it's not spending more time doing that. Because I had this vault of information that impacted who I am. Then now that vault is closed. And I realized that I didn't always take full advantage of knowing and learning when I could have. Friends, if our idea of church is to come in and leave and keep to ourselves, then we have missed what the Bible describes as church. Ananias wasn't looking for a project. God gave him one. Saul was not looking for a mentor. God gave him one. Because both realized that God was working in them, so it meant using one another in each other's lives. Let's keep reading. Let's read just a little bit more of this passage. Saul was with the disciples in Damascus for some time. Immediately he began proclaiming Jesus in the synagogues. He is the Son of God. All who heard him were astounded and said, "Isn't this the man in Jerusalem who was causing havoc for those who called on this name and came here for the purpose of taking them as prisoners to the chief priests?" But Saul grew stronger and kept confounding the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Messiah. After many days had passed, the Jews conspired to kill him. But Saul learned of their plot, so they were watching the gates day and night intending to kill him. But his disciples took him by night and lowered him in a large basket through an opening in the wall. Let's stop there. Luke, the writer here, is not apparently overly concerned with his time period. He just starts off this section. Saul was with the disciples in Damascus for some time. Sometime, according to Galatians 1:17 and 18, is 3 years. So Luke, the writer, is just like, hey, there was some time that went by. Okay, 3 years went by. Saul's in Damascus for about 3 years, and what happens during that 3 years? We don't get a lot of detail. We just find out this. Saul is strengthened, and he's learning about the Lord, and he is proclaiming the Lord. And not only is he learning about the Lord and he is proclaiming the Lord, but who was he with? It says he was with the disciples. He became part of this community of believers. See, he didn't just become a follower of Jesus, he became a follower of Jesus that was a part of a community of believers. And then he went out and he was telling other people about Jesus and what Jesus had done in his life. And so Paul being a part of this community, and now Ananias is no longer simply a missionary sent to Saul. He's a fellow brother in the church. And they begin to care for one another, and they begin to look out for one another. And not just them, the whole church. And so Saul is preaching the gospel, but there's this problem. People think, hey, Saul was adamantly against this before, but now he is the biggest proponent of this Jesus guy. We need to do something about him. And so it says the religious leaders of the day seek to kill Saul. What an irony here. Like he showed up in that city to try to destroy the work of Jesus, and now he's become part of it, and there are people who are pursuing his life. It says they're pursuing him so much that they are watching the city gates. They're just waiting for Saul to try to leave the city, and as soon as he goes through those gates, he's a dead man. So what happens? It says that there are a group of believers in that city, the part of the church that he was a part of, and they came up with a plan. They said, hey, anybody have a really big basket? Like, we need a big basket, like a sturdy basket. And so they asked around, and they found John Smith. He had a big basket. All right, hey, can we borrow this basket? All right, we need somebody who has some ropes. Does anybody have a bunch of rope? They found one of the guys, and all right, I got a bunch of ropes. And what do they do? Hey, does anybody have a house that's on the wall of the city? Or somewhere where we can kind of get close to the wall. So they get this basket and the ropes, and they get on the wall of the city, and they lower Saul out to escape the persecution that is now coming on him, so he can get away, so that he can do what? So he can go tell other people about Jesus. Here's what's going to happen from this point forward in the story. Saul is going to go around. He's going to do multiple missionary journeys, go to all different places and spread the gospel where it had not yet been spread. And he's going to write letters to the churches, letters that we still cherish today. And it all could have been stamped out right there if the community of believers hadn't put him in a basket and lowered him out the wall. This brand new believer named Saul, who was going to change the world, needed the protection of the community of believers. What do we need in our lives? We need the protection of the community of believers. We need it. We need it. Yes, if I'm guessing in your life, you are probably not running for your life, afraid that somebody is about to kill you because of your relationship and proclamation of Jesus. I'm imagining I don't need to have a meeting at the end of this service and ask who has a basket and ropes so we can lower somebody down the Talmouth Bridge. But here's what we might need. We might need to come to one another and say, hey, I'm not dealing with the same physical harm that Saul was dealing with, but I could really use some prayer. I have this thing that I'm going through, and I need some people to pray for me. People that I know aren't just going to say, yeah, I'll pray for you, but people who are genuinely going to do it. Because I believe prayer changes things. I could really use some encouragement. I'm just struggling. I know what God is saying, but I'm struggling with it anyway. I need some encouragement about some situations that I'm going through. I need the care of the body of believers. I was so excited just a couple weeks ago. Somebody was telling me that they were looking for a job, and I was like, yeah, we should try to help find something. And immediately, another church member was standing next to me. They were like, hey, I have some resources. Let me pour those into you. And I was like, that's it. That's the community of believers. Like looking out for one another. In the spiritual and in the practical. That's what we're here for. And that's why it's important that we are actually a part of the community of believers. Like if a tornado is coming and you have a storm cellar, the storm cellar is great if you're in it. But you have to be in that storm cellar for it to have any effect on you when the impending tornado. Friends, I want you to understand, the church is not a country club. It is not an elite group. The doors are absolutely wide open for anyone to become a part of not only what God is doing here, but at many, many other churches. But I also want to make one other thing clear. There is a benefit to being in a church. And part of that is that believers are called and responsible to look out for one another in a unique way. John 13:35, I believe I have this for you on the screen here. This is Jesus talking. I want you to hear what Jesus says. By this, and we're going to define what this is. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. If you have love. If you love who? One another. By this, people will know that you're my disciples, that you love whom? One another. Jesus is talking about the community of believers. I want you to understand, we absolutely spend any time around here, you're going to hear about our desire to go out to people outside of these walls. But I want you to also understand we have a special responsibility to the people that are part of the community of believers. And when we go outside of these walls, it is to invite people to be a part of the protection of the community of believers and to show them how we have a love for one another. They are welcome to. Far too many people want the concept of the protection of the church, but are unwilling to be a part of the community in the first place. And I have to be honest, it simply breaks my heart when I see people missing out. Not because we need bigger churches. Not because we need larger budgets or more buildings or anything like that, because I simply believe in what God does through the church and the encouragement that we can be to one another. So what do you need? God, people to invest in your life, you to invest in other people's lives, the protection of the church. That's simple enough. I could have just come in and said that. Saved you a bunch of time. Here's the thing. We probably all knew that coming in. And if you didn't know that about the church, you probably knew I at least felt that way about it. But when we look at one of the greatest missionaries to impact the world, many of us will say, man, I wish I had the courage of Saul. I wish God would use me. I wish God would use our church in the way that he used that guy. We can't overlook that it wasn't about him. It was never about him. It wasn't about how strong he was or how smart he was. It was about that he depended on God and he was invested in people investing into his life and him investing into the lives of other people and surrounding himself with a community of believers. I mentioned that he wrote half the New Testament. You know what it was written to? The churches. Because he loved these communities. Why? Because it all went back to what happened at the beginning of this story. Yeah, I said it's not just a story about Saul's conversion, but let's get down to it. Man, Saul got saved. Jesus did this great miracle that he's still doing today. You want to know if Jesus is doing miracles in the world today? I'll tell you, he absolutely is. And the greatest miracle that he does is he changes what is once dead to being alive. He takes a heart of stone and he turns it into a heart of flesh. And that is the greatest miracle that we can celebrate. And so just a minute, we're going to sing one last song, and we're going to worship together. I want you to know this. If you have something going on in your life, and I said, like, hey, the church is here for you. If you need somebody to talk to, just right in this area, just like walk up, and somebody's going to be like, hey, I'll be happy to talk with you. I'm going through this thing, and I need somebody to encourage me. There are people right here who are willing to talk with you. Or you might just say, man, I just need to pray. I need to pray, and I'd like to kind of just step out into prayer. And so if you want to come up here along these steps, here's what's going to happen. If you come up here and you pray, I want you to know that there's going to be a community who's just going to pray for you. Nothing weird. They're going to come up and just pray along with you. If you want to have a conversation about it, you can. If you don't, you just know that you're being prayed for. For me, I'm a blind person just hoping that Jesus is leading me. I'm a person that has benefited from others investing in my life, and I hope and pray that I'm investing in the lives of others. And even though I'm the pastor here, I'm just grateful to have this community and this family around me. So whatever you have going on in your heart, whatever God is doing, I ask you simply be obedient. You could pray here, you could pray where you're at. Simply be obedient. Let me start us off with prayer. God, be glorified. As we come to you now in prayer, God, I ask for three things. Give us the wisdom to know you, to know what it is that you're saying to us. Father, empower us to follow you. And God, keep the devil at bay. Keep him away. He's a jerk. And he is not welcome in this place. And he is not welcome in our hearts. God, show your power over all things. I lift up each person in here this morning. May you work in our hearts. May you work in our lives. And may you be glorified. It's in the holy and precious name of Jesus we ask this. Amen. Would you stand together and worship?
You unravel me with a melody, and you surround me with a song of deliverance from my enemies, till all my fears are gone. And I'm no longer a slave to fear, for I am a child of God. And I'm no longer a slave to fear, for I am a child of God. From my mother's womb, you have chosen me. Your love has called my name, and I've been born again into your family, and your blood flows through my veins. And I'm no longer a slave to fear, for I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear, for I am a child of God. Oh, 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 and I am surrounded by the arms of the Father, and I am surrounded by songs of deliverance. This is our proclamation. We've been liberated from our bondage. Yeah. We're the sons and the daughters. Let us sing our freedom. You split the sea so I could walk right through it. My fears are drowned in perfect love. You rescued me so I will stand and say, I am a child of God. You split the sea so I could walk right through it. My fears are drowned in perfect love. You rescued me so I will stand and say, a child of God. Sing that again. Yes, I am a child of God, full of grace. Yes, I am a child of God. And I'm no longer a slave to fear, for I am a child of God.
That is our prayer, that is our hope, that is our salvation, that we are no longer slaves to anything this world has, but we are children of God. I want to encourage you, if God's doing something in your heart, in your life, and you do need somebody to talk to, and you're like, hey, John, I'm super weirded out that you said people can come up here. After the service, I'm going to promise you, the pastors and probably about half the people in this room are going to hang out for like forever. So like if you need somebody to talk to and you're like, I don't want to be like obvious that I need somebody to talk to, like literally half the people in this room are still going to be here well past when you want to actually leave. And so if you need somebody to talk to, well, we're here for you. We'll be all around this room. I'll be all around this room. I'll stay as long as you need. Life Church, I'm grateful to be a part of you. Now as we go, let's go into our mission field. Let's be sent people.